The moment my brother slid that paper across the table, he was smiling. Not the kind of smile you give someone you love, the kind you give someone you've already beaten. He thought it was over. He had no idea my father had spent the last 3 years making sure it was just beginning. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old. And until 14 months ago, I was the invisible engine behind a $40 million logistics company my father built from a single delivery truck in Akron, Ohio. I ran the operations. I managed the accounts. I hired the people who made everything work. And when my father got sick, I moved back into the house on Elmwood Drive, cooked his meals, drove him to chemo, and sat with him through the nights when the pain was bad enough that neither of us could sleep. My brother did not do those things. My brother, Marcus, lived 40 minutes away in a house my father helped him buy, drove a truck my father co-signed for, and visited on holidays when it was convenient. He was charming and loud, and everyone at the company liked him because he remembered birthdays and brought donuts on Fridays. He had never once read a balance sheet in his life. But he was the oldest, and in our family, that had always meant something. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I did not go into any of this looking for a fight. I was not scheming. I was not calculating. I was grieving. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, with my hand in his and the blinds half open so he could see the yard he'd mowed every Saturday for 30 years. I held it together through the funeral. I held it together through the reception at the house, when Marcus stood at the center of every room like he was already the patriarch, already the one in charge. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself my father had been fair. I had been there. He had seen everything. He would not let me disappear into the background of my own life. I believed that until the morning Marcus called me into my father's office, which Marcus had already moved into, his coffee mug on the desk, his jacket on the chair, and told me we needed to talk about the estate. Our father had left a will. Marcus had already met with the attorney, a man named Gerald Holt, who had handled my father's legal affairs for 20 years. The meeting, Marcus explained, had gone over the basics. The house would be sold, and the proceeds split. The personal property divided. And the company, my father's company, the one I had run for the better part of a decade, would transfer entirely to Marcus as the primary heir, with a buyout clause that would pay me a lump sum of $200,000 for my shares. $200,000 for 10 years of my life. I remember the way the room felt when he said that. Like the air had thinned. Like I was trying to breathe at altitude. Dad discussed this with me, Marcus said, and he had the courtesy to look almost uncomfortable when he said it. Almost. He wanted to keep the company in one set of hands. He thought it would be cleaner. I asked him when this conversation had happened. He said it had been ongoing. Over the years, I asked why I had never been included. He said he didn't know. That's just how Dad wanted it. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment for 3 hours without turning on the lights. I thought about every weekend I had given up, every vacation I had not taken, every Friday night I had spent on the phone with a client in a different time zone while my friends were out living their lives. I thought about the year my father's largest contract had nearly collapsed because the regional manager quit without notice, and I had personally driven to 4 distribution sites in 2 days to stabilize the relationships and keep the account. I had saved the company $4 million that quarter. I had never asked for a bonus. I had never asked for recognition. I had just done the work because it was my father's company, and I loved him, and I genuinely believed that he saw what I was doing. $200,000. The next morning Marcus called again. He said Gerald Holt needed me to come in and sign a transfer document. A formality, he said, just to officially release my minority shares and acknowledge the buyout terms. He wanted it done by the end of the week so the estate could move forward. I told him I would think about it. He said there wasn't much to think about, the will was clear, the attorney had reviewed everything. The faster I signed, the faster we could both move on. I said I understood. I told him I would be in touch. What I did not tell Marcus was that 2 nights before my father died, at 2 in the morning when the house was quiet and his voice was barely above a whisper, he had told me something. He had reached for my hand and said very clearly, That he needed me to call Gerald Holt before I signed anything. He said it twice. I had assumed at the time that it was the medication talking. That he was confused, anxious, running through legal worries the way sick people sometimes do. I had squeezed his hand and told him not to worry. I had told him to sleep. After the phone call with Marcus, I sat with that memory for a long time. Then I called Gerald Holt myself. Gerald Holt had been my father's attorney since before I was born. He was 71 years old, semi-retired, with an office above a dry cleaner on Market Street that smelled like old paper and machine oil. He met me the next afternoon, and when I walked in, he stood up from behind his desk and shook my hand with both of his, and the look on his face was not the look of a man delivering routine paperwork. He asked me to sit down. He told me that yes, there was a will. Marcus had received a copy of it, and everything Marcus had told me about that document was accurate. The company shares, the buyout amount, the transfer to Marcus, all of it was real. And then Gerald Holt opened the second folder. My father had executed a separate legal instrument 14 months before he died. Not a second will. A trust. A revocable living trust that he had set up quietly, without telling Marcus, without telling anyone except Gerald, and one other person whose name I would learn later. The trust held a specific asset that had never appeared on any company document Marcus had seen, because it had been structured separately and deliberately, a controlling interest in the holding company that owned the logistics operation. 54%. Silent, invisible to a casual review of the estate, but senior to every share Marcus believed he was inheriting. The trust had one beneficiary. Gerald slid the document across the desk, and I looked at my name printed there in plain black type. And I could not speak for almost a full minute. He explained the mechanics carefully. The moment I signed the transfer document Marcus had prepared, the one releasing my minority shares, a clause in the trust would automatically activate. My signature on Marcus's document was, by design, the trigger. My father had structured it so that Marcus's own impatience, his rush to get me to sign, would be the thing that handed me everything. My father had known, Gerald said. He had known for longer than I realized. He had watched, and he had planned, and he had done it this way on purpose, because he wanted it to be clean. He wanted there to be no room for Marcus to claim the outcome was manipulated. He wanted the mechanism to be Marcus himself. I asked Gerald why my father had never told me. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said my father had worried that if I knew, I would try to handle it differently. That I would confront Marcus, or try to negotiate, or find some softer path that would ultimately leave me vulnerable. My father had known me well enough to know that I would try to protect everyone, including the person who was trying to take from me. So he had protected me instead. I drove home in a kind of silence. I don't have words for. Not peace exactly. Something heavier and more complicated than peace. My father had sat across from me at 1,000 dinners. He had watched me work myself to the edge of exhaustion for a decade. He had never once said, "I see you. I know what you're doing. You matter here." And I had carried the absence of those words like a stone in my chest for years. But he had said it, just not out loud. He had said it in a legal document, in 14 months of quiet preparation, in a folder he had given to a 71-year-old man above a dry cleaner on Market Street, and trusted to reach me at the right moment. I called Marcus the next day and told him I was ready to sign. He seemed relieved. He said he would have the document ready at the office Thursday at 10. I did not tell him I was bringing Gerald Holt. Thursday morning, Marcus had arranged the conference room. There were 2 other people there when I arrived. The company's CFO, a man named Dennis who had worked for my father for 15 years and had always been kind to me, and an outside attorney Marcus had hired to oversee the transfer. When Gerald walked in beside me, Marcus's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes. The question he didn't ask out loud, "Why does she have a lawyer?" Gerald introduced himself pleasantly, said he was there in his capacity as the estate attorney, and asked if we could take a few minutes before the signing to review all relevant documents together. Marcus's attorney agreed. Marcus said of course, no problem, and his voice was perfectly even, and I watched him glance at the transfer document on the table like he was calculating something. Gerald laid out the trust documents. He explained them methodically, without drama, the way you explain something that is simply and factually true. He identified the holding company structure. He identified the holding company structure. He identified the 54% controlling interest. He identified my name. He identified the activation clause. Marcus's attorney asked to review the documents. Gerald handed them over. The room was very quiet for about 4 minutes while the attorney read. Then Marcus said, in a voice I had never heard from him before, flatter than his normal voice, stripped of the warmth he usually performed, "This isn't what Dad intended." Gerald said respectfully that the documents reflected exactly what his client had intended. Executed 14 months prior, witnessed, notarized, and fully valid under Ohio law. Marcus said our father had been sick, that he hadn't been thinking clearly. Gerald said the trust had been executed well before any significant decline in my father's condition, and that he had documented capacity evaluations conducted at the time specifically to foreclose that argument. The attorney Marcus had hired put down the documents and looked at Marcus with the particular expression lawyers wear when they have stopped being advocates and started being realistic. He said he needed a few minutes with his client privately. Dennis, the CFO, had not said a word through any of this. He was looking at the documents on the table, and then he looked at me, and he said very quietly, "Your father told me about you. He told me a long time ago that you were the one who held this place together." He paused. I'm glad this is how it worked out. I had to look at the window for a moment. Marcus did not speak to me directly again that morning. His attorney made 2 attempts to negotiate, first suggesting a co-management arrangement, then proposing a longer buyout timeline for Marcus's shares. Gerald was polite and thorough in explaining why neither proposal was necessary or appropriate, given the terms of the trust. I signed the activation document at 11:47 a.m. The transfer of controlling interest completed automatically per the trust mechanism at the same moment. By noon, I was the majority owner of my father's company. What happened after that was not a movie. I want to be honest about that. There was no dramatic moment where Marcus was escorted from the building. There was no shouting. He finished out the week, which I think surprised people, and then he submitted his resignation, which surprised no one. I bought out his minority shares at fair market value, because that was the right thing to do, and because my father had also taught me, somewhere in the middle of everything, that doing the right thing mattered even when the other person hadn't. The harder work was the company itself. I had been running it informally for years, but running it as the owner is different. The responsibility is different. The weight of it sits in a different place. Dennis stayed on and turned out to be exactly the partner I needed. We promoted 2 people. Marcus had been quietly sidelining, a logistics coordinator named Priya who had been doing the work of a director for a manager's salary, and a route optimizer named Carl who had a mind for efficiency that I had noticed years ago and never had the authority to properly reward. Within 8 months, we had landed 2 new regional contracts and renegotiated the largest existing one at better terms. I sold the house on Elmwood Drive when the estate settled. I kept one thing from my father's office, a small framed photograph that had sat on his bookshelf for as long as I could remember. It was a picture of his first delivery truck, before the company had a name, before there was anything to inherit or fight over. He was standing in front of it, 26 years old, squinting into the sun with the particular expression of someone who has decided to bet on himself and isn't sure yet if it was wise. I keep it on my desk now. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry at my father for the way he handled things, for the silence, for the indirection, for the years I spent not knowing whether I was valued or simply useful. It's a fair question, and I've spent a long time sitting with it honestly. The answer I come back to is this. He was a complicated person who had been raised in a family where certain things were not said out loud, who loved his children imperfectly, the way most parents do, and who in the end did something very deliberate and very careful to make sure I was protected even after he was gone. I wish he had told me he was proud of me. I wish he had said it plainly on a regular Tuesday, without any documents involved. I will carry that wish for the rest of my life. But I also know that on a Tuesday morning in March, when the blinds were half open and the yard was just beginning to turn green, The last thing he did before he let go was reach for my hand. He knew I was there. He had always known.